Hi, Abhilasha. Welcome back. How are you doing?
Hi, Utkarsh. Great to be back. I'm doing well. How are you doing?
Doing very well. It's bright and sunny here in Oxford, but less bright and sunny when we look at what's happening to immigration laws overall and how essentially global mobility of talent is being questioned based on whatever is happening. So, you've had a fairly international career. For those who are not aware, Abhilasha went to IIT Delhi in India, Harvard Business School for her MBA. She got into the 2+2 program. We have a few of her master classes before. But today we're going to talk about Pico Iyer, her own mental models about thinking of international careers, why she moved back, what does the new legislation mean for international mobility. So give us a snapshot of where you are in your professional life, Abhilasha, a brief overview of how you got here, and then we can dive into Pico Iyer and everything else.
Sure. No better thing than diving into one of my favorite authors' writings and musings, which also shape a lot of my mental models. So I finally took the quote unquote entrepreneurship plunge 3 to 4 months back. And I'm building a company called Inner Stack, which is essentially a human capital empowerment platform. And the goal is that the modern day professional has to build a strong foundation, inner stack, if you will, to really keep up with the professional lives that we live. And global mobility is one element of it. There's also just adapting technologies, changing industries. Things that happened over multiple decades are now happening over a few years, or in certain cases, even a few months. So, I think it started with executive coaching, which was something that I experimented with and ended up having an unintentional product market fit during my sabbatical year. But it also extends to thinking about what form of courses, what form of tech, what form of community can help modern day professionals really think about the skills they need in the 21st century. And so that's really the premise of what I'm building right now. I think the journey to here has been all over the world, quite literally and metaphorically. I did my MBA from Harvard, and while going there, I was very sure I was going to spend a couple of years and come back. I had had extended family in the US for several decades, so I'd had a perspective of what life in the US could look like and why, I wanted to be back home in India. Um, Frankly, that certainty of the 25-year-old has definitely shifted and evolved, as happens with every, the sort of clarity and certainty of youth definitely goes away, but some things still remain, right? So I did finish my MBA, and then I ended up working for a year in the, officially in the US. And that was actually in the non-coastal areas of the US. So that was my first exposure to really the hinterlands and the Midlands in the US. But after that, I actually ended up spending about 2.5 years doing US India. So I essentially, helped, build out the business of, really SaaS business of a bioinformatics consulting organization called Elucive, one of Fast Company's top innovative companies in the biotech space. But for me, that involved really setting up the organization in India and really thinking about go to market and fundraising in the US. Because biopharma is essentially a North America, or for that matter, even a New England market in many many ways. So I honestly did. I lived the bicontinental life for about 2.5 years, and that was, in some ways, I thought it was the best of both worlds because by then I had, while I still was very excited to be back home, India, I had also started thinking of parts of the US as home, quite literally and figuratively. Um, like I said, a lot of my extended family is there. I had formed great friendships over there, and I had a strong sense of feeling of home there. But frankly, that was easier said than done. It was extremely demanding to be living across two very different time zones and also working across multiple more. So I was also looking at our expansion, or at least certain experiments in South Korea, in Europe. So I think at one point I probably had like 6 or 7 time zone clocks on my phone. Sounds really cool. It isn't.
What visa were
So
you on before you move to the next question? And what was your salary in? Was it US dollars or another currency?
great question. So I think I had only been initially on the F1, and which was the student visa. And the 1 year I worked there was actually on the regular F1 OPT, which is just the optional practical training. I was one of those folks who, like many people, did not get the H1B lottery. And in that, some ways, that simplified my decision making of leaving at least the consulting organization I was at. This was a US India company, Elucidator, which is where I moved afterwards. And after that, all my work there was always in the form of professional visits. I wasn't working there, so I was on a B1, B2. Um, so
Like
I have,
one more quick follow-up, and this is just for
sure.
people who are not super aware of the visa norms. So whether you go to
Yeah.
Harvard or you go to, say, University ABC, the H-1B is entirely a lottery. It's not really a merit-based system, is it?
It's an entirely a lottery. It's one of the most interesting immigration, and I think immigration systems in the world. And I've seen it very close to home because I've had family as well as friends on the entire spectrum from, so you have the H1B, which is lottery driven. You have L1, which is for quote unquote managerial talent that moves abroad with the company and then moves back. Then you have O1, which is the exceptional visa. You have the green card, and there are multiple paths to it. And then there's citizenship. And I've had very close friends and family at all stages of it. So I think one of the best advice that I'd give anybody who wants to think about a long-term sort of life in the US is please have an immigration lawyer on call, because there are so many nuances. And even within that, you have so many rules. Even within my F1 OP optional practical training, which is supposed to be pretty straightforward, there are interesting norms around how many days you can be outside the country, not inside the country. And this was about a decade back. So a lot of the exceptional decision making that we see today wasn't even happening then. So yeah, I think I have seen that, and I think eventually, I think for a lot of people there are a lot of people after business school who join such an India US startup. The hope is you're initially not even, you're basically on a B1, B2, professional visitor visa. And some people go down the route of that moving with that company to back to the US or whatever on an L1 path, etc. And at the time when I had joined, I had no idea what the future held, right? But yeah, I think in that sense, for me, COVID solved quote unquote many things, because as my 2.5 years were getting over at Elucidator, we realized that Asia and Europe weren't going to be markets in the biopharma space in the near term. And biotech was all of North America, and travel was no longer an option with COVID. So for me, I think a big question came up that if I've decided India is home and I want to establish roots and a sense of belonging here, it might, and this is a personal choice, it might actually be very important for me to establish roots or some sort of presence within India instead of trying to straddle two very different worlds. And India had changed, right? 2015 to 2020 is some of the most, it's a very interesting time to be outside India, because you'd had, really the proliferation of geo, you'd had UPI come in and take shape. So the market was completely different. But between Harvard, working at Insight, and then working at Elucidator, I'd basically been out of this space for about 5.5 years. Um, so I think that was a pretty conscious choice. And in some ways, the COVID timing of 2020 was like, hey, we're not giving you an option. You better sort of now start sticking to the market you're working in. And after that, for 5 years, I think the next sort of 4 to 5 years were in very Indian companies, if you will. So I was chief of staff to the CEO at Hike, which was the, at the time when the Messenger was evolving to its next bet on gaming as well as crypto. And that was very focused on the India market. And after that, I sort of, ran product and then growth at a direct to consumer brand called Open Secret, which was again 100% for the India market. And in many ways, I think that was great because these 5 years of 2020 to 2025 actually helped me establish a sense of home uh, as an adult in India, right? So, really a sense of belonging, my own sort of point of view on the country and cities as an adult, like actually like bought my first car, made certain asset investments. So a lot of the concepts of establishing some roots happened. And now I think as I'm building inner stack, and even I work quite globally with people, and I'm very open to the idea of global consumers. But these 5 years of investing and establishing roots actually gives me a sense of structure or a sense of rootedness to explore, which if I had kept living unsettled, as happens by choice or circumstance, I don't think I would have had that rootedness. So it's kind of a full circle now as I think about a global consumer base, but it feels far more settled and rooted than it did when I did the same path, excuse me, about 5, 6 years back.
So tell us, let me ask you a broad question. Try and connect Pico here, one of
Yeah,
your favorite authors, um, the new H-1B regulations,
yeah,
and the broader aspiration of somebody who goes to, say, a top MBA program. Generally, what you and I know is that people do want to work abroad for a few years, make some money perhaps, just get a different exposure. How's that changing? Try and connect the dots. I'll let you answer this anyway. With a short, like if I were to just give you some guiding principles, what I see in the market is that trying to get a job these days, even if you went to a
yeah,
top MBA program in US or Europe, it's not easy. It takes a
yeah,
while and it's extremely nerve-wracking for people. Compound this with the global aspirations that we are sold on Netflix, and all of us
yeah.
want to be able to have a global life wherever we live. Um, that's kind of getting challenged by norms, by the availability of jobs. So is Pico Iyer a pipe dream today, given the reality? Is the precise question.
It probably is.
But you
Um,
have to tell us about why you like
and
the author. Not everyone knows who Pico
yeah,
Iyer is.
I think Pico Iyer is a phenomenal writer who's really written about like traveling all over. He actually grew up in the UK, moved to the US as a teenager adult, and then moved to Japan. And then continues to spend most of his adult life in Japan. And almost all of his writing is at the intersection of philosophy and travel, in a very, and watched how travel shapes you. So travel is less as a tourist and more as a traveler. I mean, there's so many layers to him, so I'd recommend the audience go and check it out, but that's the broad narrative. So I'll answer it in two ways, right? In some ways, it's harder, but in some ways, it's easier. And I'll come to the harder and easier part. I think it's harder because you can't just be drifting along, right? So I also had family who moved to the US in the 70s, and you could have drifted along. And I met a lot of their family, friends, etc. And they were like, oh, we just came here, and then we didn't even know when the student visa became the H-1B, and the H-1B became green card, and green card became citizenship. And here we are like 40, 50 years later, and I'm still here, and I never went back. So in some ways, it was very easy. You kind of, there's a lot of fluidity in place. And I'm speaking more of the US context, but this does apply in certain other ways where within 10 odd years, you didn't even realize when you had fully sort of gotten the immigration path done. And that became so that part has become harder, right? In terms of you have to be very, very focused in terms of like actually crossing these loops and hurdles, particularly if you're of Indian origin or Indian passport holder, and also a couple of other nationalities which have certain that it's particularly harder. But here's where I'd say it's easier. Earlier, you could just drift along and somehow end up somewhere, and not always happily, right? I've attended family events with the average age being 60, 65 in the suburbs in the US, and people going like, we never thought about this, we kind of just drifted along and there was nothing difficult, so the default helped us just stay there, and we're not sure if this is a good outcome, right? And I spoke to, and people were on all ends of the spectrum, but there was a certain degree of we weren't intentional about this. Today, for better or for worse, whether you like it or you don't, you have to be fairly intentional. Uh, in terms of if you want to pursue it, you'd have to be very intentional about choosing a certain set of, like, really figuring out ways for it. And I think that in some ways is making it the way I'd say easier or at least more intentional, is you have to step back and think, do I want this? And what are the trade offs I'm willing to make for it? In fact, today, if you had to sort of live, at least in the US, you'd have to spend several years of your 20s and 30s thinking, not just thinking, but acting on immigration if you wanted to live there,
There's one
which,
person on Network Capital who I just referred for the O1 visa, I think, or one of the
yeah,
exceptional talent visas, just making her case that she's done ABC with the community. And this person is a remarkably successful person who went to a remarkable school and
yeah,
works in a company that I would imagine pay her quite a bit of money. And
yeah.
there is palpable anxiety, even if a person who's 10, 12 years out of school, you can imagine like where she would be in a tech company about where this person goes. And I was like, wow, that is a lot of stress to take on. It's quite the opposite of what you were describing, that it became sort of happened over time.
Yeah, and that shift is getting even more pronounced, literally year on year. So I remember when I, for example, forget the professional visas, and I'm sure we would have sort of gone to business school at similar times. So I went to Harvard in 2015. The thought of the student visa being something which was like, hey, you might get it or you might not get it, was something nobody ever thought about. It was a given, right? If you had an admit from a school like Harvard, you would get your student visa. And all of, and Harvard has been in the eye of the storm in many ways. So today, a decade later, when like, and I sort of advised and mentored a couple of people, and I'm like, frankly, all of your questions and apprehensions are spot on. The certainty that I had even around the student life is not there for you today. So today, when you make your mental model and decisions about, say, even studying in the US, you have to be like, you have to bake in the assumption that you will have to put in a lot of extra effort to make sure you de-risk it from whatever happens, um, and whatever is within your control. And that's a shift that's happened in the last decade. And my assumption is there is going to be more volatility over the next 5, 10 years. Most problems can be solved, but you have to think about how much time and effort you want to commit to pursuing that path and what the trade-off is if to live that life.
Okay, tell us about the mental models now. Now that you're building a company, you've obviously been a remarkably successful professional, exceptional academic backgrounds, but you've also coached people like yourself, people senior than you, junior to you. Talk to us about mental models for a career pivot or thinking about this amidst the visa storm. What should a person do?
I think in many ways, it's almost like one has to have a certain strategy and vision. I rather first begin with a vision or strategy of one's life. So in many ways, just cut out the noise for a bit and really ask yourself, what is your vision of a good life? And sort of at a level, do it at an abstract, which means like it's high salary, it's sort of like community, it's like proximity to culture or heritage or whatever those pillars are. Have that first in isolation of all the noise, because some of our, today we live in such a sort of cluttered world digitally that some of our impressions of what we want or don't want are actually not our own. They are very much informed by the zeitgeist, the conversation happening at that time, and you may or may not want that. So I think that first and second and even third order thinking of what you want and why is very liberating. It also helps to do the second and third order thinking, which is this coming from an empowered place? Or is this just something I grew up with, so I feel like I need to live one way or the other? And one sort of mid, early 30s, etc., is a very good time to be asking those questions. Like, what is important to you? What makes a good life for you? And of course, that can keep changing, but by and large, if you've done proper structured, thoughtful introspection, that question can give you a stable answer for 4 or 5 years. And be like, hey, if this ABC changes, I'm going to revisit this. Very simple, similar to how a company thinks about the world or industries in very volatile and uncertain times. So you have a vision of the future, and then you sort of, and also you have to think about what's relatively important, not important. And then that's when it comes to my next favorite question in coaching or anywhere rather is what is the trade off? What are you willing to give up to make this happen? There are always trade offs. And I think while the sort
Give
of
us
notion that,
examples as you walk us through this
oh,
trade-off.
absolutely. So, when we're young, we kind of have this. So, I am a math, I've had a very deep mathematical background. You expected there to be a perfect answer X. That if I solve for this, this is the perfect answer. And in some ways, X is the highest number or most optimum output you could get. Real life is far more gray. It's far more murky, right? So let's say if you choose to be in India, you might have find it easier to build a company hypothetically because you have almost no visa, restrictions or limitations. But you might be losing out access to a market in case you were based in the US. And you need to stop and think what matters to you at that point and why, right? So there isn't one answer. And I think I see a lot of professionals as well as for their personal and professional life trying to find the elusive X, which does not have any trade-offs. That just doesn't exist. It doesn't even exist in business decisions, right? So when you chase just growth, you sometimes trade off on profitability. When you pursue profitability, you have the cognizance that you're going to be sort of maybe not giving up on growth, but you're sort of, it might be tempered. So I think chasing this sort of ideal state, and it could exist in very, very rare circumstances, but in most cases, there is no scenario which has no trade off. Um, and trade-offs aren't necessarily bad, right? I think so. There's also a bit of if you can bring neutrality to that assessment and say, hey, here are the trade-offs, and here is the set of pros and cons that I feel most happy with right now with these assumptions. That's a great, good enough decision, right? That's a good enough decision in one's personal life. That's a good enough decision in business. We live in such volatile times that the worst outcome you can have is not deciding anything because there's no perfect outcome. There's no perfect outcome in business today because, tech will change, regulation will change, yada, yada, yada. And today, honestly, all of that applies to one's personal life, especially if you want it to be somewhat global in nature, because there those policy uncertainties, etc., also come in. So I think just summarizing good enough decisions and stepping back and seeing where you want to go. And third, just thinking about trade-offs with like kind of inevitable, and there's nothing really problematic about it, but just pick the trade-off that makes sense for you.
Can you talk
Um,
more about personal trade-offs that people who want to build a global career have to make? And I mean, visa may or may not be a part of it, but often does. Like, just walk us through what you've seen among your friends and like what you know.
I mean, I think the biggest is you don't necessarily, and it's a bit philosophical, but bear with me. I think your sense of home,
I
that
studied
word,
philosophy, so this is
I'm
home
sure.
turf. Yeah.
Um, the notion home is no longer a static place. And that's great in some ways. Multiple places can feel like home, but also no single place feels like home, right? So there is a certain degree of you've sort of, and if you've seen more, I think, and this is what I had, even written in that post, is in a way, I wish I could bring all the experiences and all the people in this one space-time continuum, which isn't possible. And I contrast this with certain friends who sort of I grew up with in Delhi, who sort of lived, worked, and like 95, 99% of their lives has been fully anchored in Delhi, right? So that's a very different experience. And in some ways, the trade off is I'm glad that I can think of at least three or four cities in the world that feel like home. But at the same time, I have traded off the fact that for my friends who've spent 99% of their lives, not just physically, but in many ways just focused in on Delhi, I never think of Delhi as a complete home in the way that they do. Um, and those are two just paths. I don't think one is better or the other, but it definitely does have trade-offs.
And to add on to this, I think whether you decide to have a partner, whether you decide to get married, who you decide to get married to, should you date locally, locally as in like where you go and study, these are questions that people can't really plan but need to factor in, right? Imagine
Yeah,
you start dating somebody and then your H-1B expires, or you plan something and then you find out that you may not be able to enter the country. These are things that used to happen less frequently, but
yeah,
now there are cases that we are hearing off and on. And I wonder whether this will make the world more insular, because if you follow the logic, that means that you typically will need to have friends, date, people
yeah.
who have the same passport, who are guaranteed a life either in a particular place or move. So this entire concept of a global couple or global set of friends or a group of friends could become a bit more challenging, which may have negative repercussions, I feel.
It definitely could. And that's something that scares me a bit. As somebody whose 20s and 30s had a lot of that. Um, and with all its challenges, I would say that it sort of added a certain richness. The ability to see so many shades of life perspectives that is going to potentially go away. But then again, I mean, as a history buff, we know it's all cyclical. So these things come and go. And I think in some ways, clarity around what one wants helps you decide if something is worth the effort. So I think that's going to happen. And I do think external circumstances have a role to play. And there will be a greater push towards, being more local. But if something truly matters, you're going to make it work. I'll give a simple example, and it's not even about like a partnership, right? One of my best friends is a Pakistani who lives in the US. We can never visit each other's like
And she's
home
a
country
Pakistani person by citizenship as
by
well.
citizenship, by
Okay.
citizenship as well. We met at HBS. We can never visit each other's countries, right? So if she's visiting home to Pakistan, or if when I live in India, we could literally be a few kilometers apart, but we can never meet. And that's just, and I think our friendship since we graduated has just deepened because when I go to, so for Boston, part of the reason I think of it as home is because besides my family that lives there, she and her family and her, husband and, kids live there. So that is home for me. And I've sort of been a part of major milestones in her life through that. We travel, so we've intentionally traveled. Again, that is harder, especially with our passports. But I think it's the intentionality has to be higher. If we just let it drift, I mean, it wouldn't survive, which would have been much easier, let's say, earlier, where mobility was. For a few decades where mobility had become easier, I don't think that was a permanent thing. It was a very last couple of decades phenomenon where mobility was easier, is easier.
Yeah. And now there is an overreaction from different people on different sides of the spectrum. And the overreaction is this, that people have forgotten that some amount of skilled migration is what made different parts of the world the melting pot of cultures, the home of innovation, etc. It matters at a personal level because when you engage with people who don't share, say, your politics or your values, you grow from such disagreements. It matters
Yeah.
for innovation. Silicon Valley is a thriving example of multiple cultures creating magic, so to speak. And it also matters for creating better global politics. But that sort of made way for some people justifying different forms of immigration. But this kind of pollination of cross pollination of cultures essentially made innovation happen in the US. That seems to be under the threat. But you're right, it's cyclical. Things will perhaps fall back into place or in a relatable. What's the main lesson that uh, students or young professionals need to draw if they're, say, forced to come back to their home country or go to, a visa-friendly country for a few years? How are careers truly getting international, or are careers also getting very localized and, say, Dubai specific or Bombay specific, and so forth?
So I do think certain degrees of localization will happen as sort of visa and immigration norms become harder. But I'd also say these, within these local contexts, companies are attempting to also see if we can cater to a global consumer while potentially being localized as well, right? So people build for, let's say for the world from XYZ. Now, again, all of that, there are certain questions coming around tariffs and what's under tariff, etc. So we'll see. But I think it's for me, and I don't want to sound reductionist, or I don't want to say that these problems aren't real. I think the silver lining is to think about this is forcing me to ask some hard questions that I could have drifted along with earlier, right? Where I wasn't being forced to make a decision. Like, yeah, you could still pursue an education in the US, work in the US, but you should be prepared that that's going to take X amount of effort or work or intentionality. So
Hmm.
step back and ask yourself if you really wanted it. Uh, I mean, and like even when I went to the US for my MBA, I hadn't thought of those questions, right? Because
Because you knew that you had the option,
yeah,
by virtue of the fact that it's one of the best business schools. You've done well for yourself. You knew that you should have worries, but that would probably not be the number one worry. That's not true today.
it's
Um,
not.
what about salaries? Like, why do people want to build a career in the US? One can be US or Europe or wherever. One can be just like growing culturally, seeing what
Yeah.
life is in a different, which adds a lot of value. The other could be money. So, do you think that people who come back from the US to India take a big salary cut in general? You don't need to talk specific companies or so forth. Or PPP adjusted, purchasing power parity adjusted. It's actually India is a pretty well paying nation for top talent.
So and this is also an evolving answer. So I think first, yes, it is PPP adjusted. It's I never had to, and I know very few people who had to, with the PPP adjustment, really take a sort of pay cut in that sense. But that's also assuming PPP assumes that you live and spend in the same country. right? So if you move to India, the assumption is you're going to be living and staying in India, which you do. But if you have a global life, there are also things like you're traveling to the US. Now you're earning in India, and if you travel there, it's a different ball game versus sort of earning there. Having said that, I think by and large, PPP adjustment is has I don't think I think, but there's also we need to remember that money is psychological. So sometimes it's not, I mean, you know the logic of PPP adjustment, but you might think, hey, I made, let's say, 120K USD. And now if I convert my INR salary to USD, even, and so a lot of people don't even think about PPP. They're like, I'm making lesser money. And that can be a real thing. So I think that, I think just understanding and like really absorbing PPP adjustment is one. Two, and these are new trends. There are certain sectors where there is no PPP adjustment. People are paid at par irrespective of where they live. Um, this has happened in industries like finance, it's happened in crypto, it's happened in certain segments of tech, and I don't know where it will go, right? And many times it used to be an arbitrage, even for companies, because you could have like talent in another country where the PPP adjustment was possible. But today it's changing. So you kind of have to see where it goes. But I just say, I think while making financial decisions, it's helpful to step back and say, hey, what are the associations and emotional beliefs I have about money? And then look at the information that you have in front of you. Otherwise, it can be a really intimidating thought. Right? It can be, and people from extremely like business and mathematical backgrounds shy away from really looking at the data because it's there's so much emotions and beliefs, et cetera, associated with it, and very human. So, but yeah, I think it is like PPP adjustment was always there, and always you were corrected for, but today that's changing. But let's not pretend that the emotions and beliefs around money are just around the number. They are very much about how it defines you or you define it.
Yeah, and we all compare, right? We compare our
Yeah.
lives with our former selves. We compare our lives with, of course, the LinkedIn life that many people have, and all of those kinds of things. It's very natural, but glad that we should be aware of it. Would you agree that people who have backgrounds like people have in network capital, like generally ambitious, kind, well-educated folks, I think there's many of us start having some money by 30s, right? Not too much, like, but like some money like starts coming late 20s, 30s. How have you seen the evolving visa norms, etc., change asset allocation decisions? Where to buy a house, car, stocks, and so forth? Is there anything, is this something you can comment on based on what you've observed or coached?
I think it's a very tricky question. I mean, it's not a tricky question. It's more like it is a very real question with a very tricky set of answers. And so sometimes the questions that are arising, and I'm sure lots of companies are being built in this space, is what are the investments that are more transferable in nature versus what are truly asset investments? So if you move a house, there's no real way of holding on to that house, especially if it was a living property versus an investment property across the board. But I think I think it's becoming, those questions are becoming real. I and there people, a lot of your beliefs around what is your investment philosophy, why are you buying a certain asset or not, why are you investing, start coming into place. Um, so I do think that's playing a role, but I think the answers are extremely personal. The two themes that I've really seen are, one is the concept of almost transferability, which is like, will it be really difficult if I were to make these investments, et cetera, and move? So almost financial mobility of that asset. And the second are very much related to your own why you invest the way you do. But it is going to be an interesting question. Like, I know a lot of people, again, gold is constantly comes up, and gold is like rising like nobody's business, because even now there's some notion of universally recognized value, if you will. But it's going to be interesting times. And I think for me, and this is sort of a theme that's emerging across a lot of my own personal work as well as, or my personal decision making as well as professional work, is that uncertainty is now a feature. It's a feature of life, not a bug. Uncertainty, volatility, changes should not be seen as a one-off. It's better to assume, as we've done with businesses for the last decade. Now, as individuals, we should kind of be more prepared for the fact that, hey, this uncertainty is not a one-off. Like we just had the H1B sort of ruling come out, and then there have been like at least the last 10 days different announcements of what it is or what it isn't. And I think the common conversation I've seen is this is not the first and only ruling. There will be multiple, and which will be in many directions. So I think one good premise to think about is that this uncertainty is going to be a feature of our lives and not a bug. And I mean that in two ways. One, it's going to happen a lot more. And two, just take it for what it is and don't be too scared of it. Because it'll happen so often that sometimes, if you're too scared of it, a lot of the responses will be the primal instincts
Yeah.
of fear, risk, fear, anger, etc., which will just hamper responses to it. Because I think a lot of it is going to end up happening.
I feel that we are the uncertain generation. Uncertainty often comes with some anxiety as well, which one is slightly better to handle in early 20s because one doesn't have too much to lose. In late 20s, early 30s, you start having some
Yeah.
things which which you prefer not to lose, etc. But I definitely see uncertainty and anxiety go hand in hand. And there are, of course, people who handle it slightly better. But there comes a time when perhaps people start getting older, or perhaps when they have had too much, they say that, okay, I want to go to a place where my uncertainty is minimized. I just want to not worry about, say, visa, or I don't want to every day to keep looking at the news to see whether my assets are valued at X or Y.
Yeah.
And I think this quest for stability in a reality where there's so much uncertainty is definitely not easy. Um, what is your advice to people who have to negotiate this? This is the reality today, especially for a global career aspirant.
I think it's extremely real. And, at the risk of being a broken record, it helps to define what is important to you and why. So, for example, and I'll take my own personal example, when I eventually was like, hey, I'm not going to try and live in the US long term, it wasn't at that time, I was probably in my late 20s. I'd spent 4 or 5 years there. I That felt like home as well. The naivety of my early 20s had gone. But I think for me, it was very clear that I didn't, for me, like it was still a question, and India was still winning that, India versus US debate. And the trade-offs of like spending all my 30s thinking about visa and like regulation and like even just having to keep up with the regulation wasn't worth it. So in some ways, and for me it was very clear, like I knew what pros India held, I knew what cons staying felt there, and then just kind of living with it. I also like often like a lot of spoken to a lot of people who wanted to move to India, and I was like, don't think of this as a dream. This has trade-offs, but so does your decision of staying in the US. So I think this navigation, the best way is to actually step back, make a certain set of decisions and assumptions, um, without the noise, without the sort of constant, rhetoric. Choose what makes sense for you, and then feel comfortable with that choice for 5, 7 odd years, because otherwise it can become extremely like difficult if you constantly a don't make a choice and b constantly compare yourself. It makes life very hard. So I think clarity around what you want and why you need it
Hmm.
helps. And I mean, I'm somebody who loves the pen and paper. So I also encourage people to sometimes write it down, because you tend to forget why you made certain decisions. And then when the going gets rough, you're like, hey, was I an idiot? And you probably weren't, right? You probably thought through a lot of the assumptions, and there were certain unknown unknowns. So, in some ways, I think just like putting that upfront sort of thinking and clarity And then knowing that there'll always be unknown unknowns helps. So just having a strong foundation for oneself, again, easier said than done, but will is now necessary in the world we will not just we are currently living in, but we'll continue to live in, where volatility will become pretty common and we don't even know what aspects it's going to hit.
Yeah, I mean, the markets being one, career being the other. Um, you building in a stack. Let's wrap up with that. I think a lot of your conversations and insights have given us a flavor into your mental models for work, life, philosophical upliftment, challenges, and so forth. Why are you building in a stack? What's the reason for that? What's the broad customer looking like? What's the tech angle? Isn't that primarily a human endeavor? Your
Yeah.
insights on this.
No, great question. And it's, I think so. For me, I've worked in a variety of different industries, right from B2B to sort of biopharma to consumer tech to D2C. And I've surprisingly, and I'd now say, had the benefit of working in a variety of functions. Right from product marketing, strategy. At some point, I even did sales, which was not something I expected to do. But I think overall, and these were all very challenging, but frankly, the hardest question that I had actually the benefit of tackling in a lot of my startup operator roles was people, which is how do you help people figure out their highest potential in through a set of skills, right? Through different interventions. And I think, some of these interventions exist. So, for example, network capital really solves for this from creating a community and a repertoire of knowledge around it. For me, a few that seemed very relevant were one was coaching, which was just at an inflection point in your life. You can save yourself a lot of churn, a lot of unhappiness by working with a coach. Coach is a very strong sparring partner who's also not judgmental and is trained to listen in a certain way. So I think that's for me is at your most critical inflection points, and that's what Inner Stack is being built on. And in many ways, I'm building reverse of my career. I'm actually going very services and people and deep first instead of tech first because I don't think we know the answer. I don't think we know what works. So that's been a lot of like one-on-one coaching helps, and that's one way of in which people can build their human stack, inner stack. The second is at many points, even courses, right? If you think about back to your business school, the highest leverage courses were actually around themes like negotiation, like for that matter, like authentic communication. And
Hmm.
I think in the world we live today, we also have to start thinking about levers like resilience or adaptability. And while we all have our base levels, these can be learned or improved over time. So I think the soft skills, and I hate the terminology soft skills, that is going to expand and become even more and more critical in a world which has so much sort of change at a sort of regulatory level, but also at a technology level.
Hmm.
And tech is the last one, and I'd say it's like 5 to 7 years out. And it's almost right now a theoretical concept. But as a product person, I've often seen that we now understand a lot about human or consumer behavior to get them to get our consumers to scroll more, to get our consumers to sort of buy more.
Yeah.
And I think that's a lot of it is based on consumer psychology and understanding how to design user experiences to augment that. The longer pipe dream is that certain behaviors and nudges could also, and there's already some work on this, could be used to help you pursue the goal you define.
Hmm.
So I think the goal for me, and Stack's going to probably be a decade or if not longer build, maybe forever, is different components to build, which could support people at different stages of their life. Uh, and I think the first one, honestly, the one which I'm continuing to go deepest on is coaching and hopefully courses soon. So that's the sort of model because it's the hardest problem. And I think one thing which, and this is kind of really top of mind of the website, which I finally should launch, is we put in a lot of thought, a lot of money, and a lot of audacity into things like, AI, virality, semiconductors. I think humans deserve the same audacity.
Hmm.
Like thinking about helping unlock it both through EQ and IQ deserves a build. And it's a very interesting problem to think about and work on. So that's sort of the broad thesis.
Perfect. So truly built in India, built for the world. Fair to
Yes,
describe? Okay, love it.
completely.
Abhilasha Sinha, ladies and gentlemen. Thank you so much, Abhilasha. We'll launch this in a couple of days, but truly appreciate your insights. Very, very relatable. And I think the mental models people will take away at different stages in their career would be precious. Thank you.
Amazing.